Picture the scene. It's the mid-1930s in America. You're an agricultural laborer walking through the fields and valleys of Wisconsin looking for some work, the full of mice and men treatment. It's getting late, but luckily you've spotted a farm up ahead, so you decide to make for the farm and hope that the person that lives there is friendly enough to let you stay the night and perhaps will let you work. You see the farmer of the place coming towards you, and before you can say a word, the farmer says,
Vooral nou wat een goede tijd om hier te gaan, als het aan mijn tijd wordt, gezondheid weer uitgeeft. En ik heb wat fietsen en overal heen en door in de natuur terug. En we wat meer met vee bezig en in de landen bezig.
What? So, in case you didn't know, that was Frisian. And this is actually a plausible historical scenario, as I'll get into in this video. Now, before that, I've talked about Frisian before on this channel, particularly about the older forms of Frisian, Old Frisian, its link with Old English in this video, as well as about the Frisians as a seafaring and traveling people that were very entrepreneurial, big traders back in the Dark Ages, and that they may even have gone as far afield as the Faroe Islands. But it didn't just stop then, and in the second half of the 19th century, there was rather a large wave of emigration, not just from the Netherlands in general, but particularly also from the northern area of Friesland, where the Frisians live in the Netherlands, leaving behind their claygrounds and woodlands for pastures new in a diverse array of lands and territories across the world. As I mentioned in this video, some of them also went to the east, to Poland, to form settlements and small colonies there as well. But in today's video, I want to talk about those that went the other way, the Frisians that went west to America and founded a Frisian-speaking enclave in Wisconsin.
The USA, greatest country in the world.
In particular, I'm going to talk about the town called Randolph Center, which was renamed to Friesland in 1910 at the request of the inhabitants, which says something about the makeup of its population. Now, it's in south-central Wisconsin and actually first appeared around 1844, when we know that many of the first inhabitants were not Frisian but rather Welsh. A second wave of large-scale migration, such as throughout much of the United States and indeed much of the Midwestern region, was of German immigrants coming in from Germany, as well as from Switzerland and several other areas which were German-speaking at this time. However, it's from 1881 that we get the first reference to immigrants from Friesland, a northern province in the Netherlands, showing up in Randolph Center. And indeed, we know that the greatest wave of migration of Frisian immigrants to this area came between 1890 and 1910. And in 1910, there was a census which can tell us a lot about the linguistic and demographic situation in Randolph Center, or as it had recently been renamed, Friesland, Wisconsin. Now, a lot of the information for this video comes from the excellent research by two researchers, Joshua Busquet and Todd Eresman. There'll be links in the description below to several of these open access articles on various aspects of this speech community. And it's using research that they collated from the 1910 census that we are able to see something of the demographic makeup of the town, split into first generation and second generation speakers. First generation being those who were born abroad, while second generation are those who were born in the township itself, but had at least one parent that was born abroad. And from this, we can see that the largest total by some way is that of the Frisians inside this city, with the Germans coming a fairly close second. But what's very interesting is how many first generation Frisians are present in 1910, showing that this wave of immigration was newer than that of the Germans, Welsh, and others inside the township. This is commented on in their 2010 article about West-Frisian in Wisconsin, in which they write, "As would be expected, English proficiency reporting tends to be higher among second-generation Wisconsin Frisians than first-generation, and English proficiency is higher among individuals who have been in Wisconsin longer. A good example of this is the Smith family, farmers who immigrated to Wisconsin in 1904. The parents, as well as the first 7 children, were first-generation Wisconsin Frisians, with the second child, a 4-year-old second-generation Wisconsin Frisian, almost certainly a proficient Frisian speaker, though no linguistic proficiency is noted. Similarly, fitting the pattern, but on the other end of the spectrum, is the Dijkstra family, also farmers who immigrated in 1881. Both parents report Frisian monolingualism, but their 3 children report English proficiency. This is an interesting point because, as we would expect, those children of immigrants who grew up in America would have learned English at a higher rate than those who had come over. However, what's interesting about this is that despite the fact that the children of immigrants and their children also learn English, for around 120 years in Friesland, Wisconsin, Frisian continued to be spoken, which goes against other patterns of immigrant communities that would often switch to speaking English much faster. Part of this may be down to the fact that many streets in this town were 75% West-Frisian inhabited at this point, meaning it was quite a densely populated area with many speakers of the same language living in close proximity to one another, thus reinforcing the linguistic identity and the capability of people speaking West Frisian to have other speakers with whom to speak the language. Another interesting point picked up on by Busquet and Egersman is that of the monolingualism. This is where someone speaks only one language, and in this case only West Frisian. Now, it was noted in the census that those being recorded as West Frisian speakers are ethnically written down as Holland Fries. Of this category of 105 monolingual speakers, 102 of those were Frisian, despite the fact that we know that there were 60 Dutchmen, showing that only 3 monolingual Dutchmen were living in Randolph or Friesland at this time in 1910. This fits a wider pattern that we see, that despite the fact that there were also significant numbers, especially of German speakers, and somewhat lower numbers of Dutch speakers, it seems to be the West Frisian language which becomes linguistically dominant in the area and that holds on longer than the German and Dutch languages. Part of this can again be explained by settlement patterns. This is because around 60% of the inhabitants of Randolph at this time had at least one Frisian parent, which is a really huge number for quite a small immigration area coming from the Netherlands. This is actually reflected in one of the interviews that was performed, which reads in Frisian and talks about a German boy who went to school in Randolph, and he said, "De meesten die tot school gingen dan, waren meer Friesen dan Duitsers. Dat hij zei dat hij de eerste dag dat hij naar de school ging, daar kwam hij thuis en zei het zijn mam, ik moet het Fries leren, anders ben ik net meer in bij de oren, want de oren praten altijd Fries." Which translates to, the most that went to school then, there were more Frisians than Germans. He saw that on first day that he went to school. Then he came home and said it to his mum, "I have to learn Frisian or else I won't fit in with the others because the others always speak Frisian." Now note that the Frisian here is written down in what's called as I dialect, so it doesn't conform to standard Frisian spelling, and there are certain words and non-standard forms. So some of it may sound rather clunky and not quite like Frisian from the Netherlands, but that's to be expected as this is a partially literate immigrant community rather than people speaking perfect Afuk Fries, so don't slaughter me in the comment. That point aside, this is a rather incredible source because it shows that even people that were not ethnically Frisian or had a Frisian parent, after going to school, the school which was taught in English, they found that on the playground the lingua franca was Frisian. And so they felt that they had to learn Frisian rather than, as one would expect, that they felt the need to learn English, seeing as they had migrated to America. So this makes for a rather interesting case study. Part of the reason behind the fact that Frisian became a lingua franca instead of, say, Dutch, which could of course become a common language for both the Dutch and the Frisian communities, hypothetically, inside the township, is that the Frisian speaker community was one, far larger than the Dutch speaker community, but also similarly to the German community, was more densely situated in the same areas. They were more closely grouped together, and so they had stronger ties with more Frisian speakers, meaning that the language was used more in these areas and could expand out also to other areas when large numbers of people from those Frisian speaking areas moved into further domains, i.e. onto the playground. Now, it also meant that because only around 5% could speak Dutch in Randolph, they would have to learn another language to communicate with the other 95%. And so it seems that there were only 3 monolingual Dutch speakers of the 105 Dutch and Frisian monolinguals, because the Dutch community had to learn another language to speak with the Frisians, or to speak with the Germans, or to speak with the Americans and others inside the town. However, for the Frisians, this wasn't quite as pressing, because around 60% was potentially Frisian speaking in the town. So some of them, indeed, we know 103 of them, could also decide not to learn another language and just to keep speaking Frisian, which is what they did. So purely in terms of numbers, but also in terms of social networks, we see that being a monolingual Dutch speaker would be fairly isolating, seeing as though the Dutch were spread out around the township rather than in one area, meaning that in your street you maybe would only be able to speak with 1 or 2 people outside of your direct family. However, for the Frisians living in much more tight-knit communities, remembering of course that some streets were entirely populated by ethnic Frisians speaking Frisian, and most were 75% in certain areas, it meant that they could get away with speaking only Frisian in this way. This is rather interesting, the feature of the monolingual speaker, and how this helps to glue together the language identity of the people in this township, particularly the West-Frisians, with such a high amount of monolingual speakers. Of course, most of those being the first generation immigrants that had come over from Friesland and had not brackets yet learned to speak another language, although many of them seem to have continued to be monolingual speakers. This is because even if there is only one monolingual Frisian speaker in the household, most often this would be the mother of the family who would be doing jobs inside the household in the more private domain where Frisian was the main language. The husband, however, who would go out and work with other members of the community, would often be the first to pick up the English language, and then the children would of course learn English in school. And so even if we only have one monolingual speaker, this would dictate that the language of the family used together would have to be Frisian, because she couldn't understand English. And indeed, this meant that Frisian would be preserved as a language inside the household, even if others in the household would be able to communicate in English with the wider community. If there were enough such monolingual Frisian speakers, and indeed bilingual Frisian speakers, it would mean that the monolingual speaker could still function within the community and within the household. The question of the linguistic domain is also an important one when it comes to considering Friesland, Wisconsin. As we've already discussed, the household was the main domain of the Frisian language, spoken between families in private together. Another seems to have been in agricultural work, with those Frisians that owned farms in the area having hired help to help them out on the farm, as was done pre-mechanization. This was often the more unskilled laborers that would come over, first generation immigrants who hadn't yet learned the language, who would go and work on the farm. And so that remained a Frisian language domain. In terms of women working, a lot of the time they would work as servants or maids to other Frisian speaking families within the home, which, as we've already discussed, was a Frisian language domain. And so those only speaking Frisian would be able to move into these jobs, these types of employment, and so further refresh the linguistic character of the language. This is also brought out in some of the interviews done by Busquet and Eresman. This is from one of the immigrants that moved to Wisconsin following the Second World War. She said, "Wel, en ik die later huiswerk, voor different meisken, ik leek het ook zo goed om hier bij Randolph en Friesland te werken. En er kon de meisken altijd een woord vriezen." Which roughly translates to, well, and later I did housework, for different people. I also liked working here in Randolph and Friesland a lot, and a lot of people could always speak a word of Frisian, which shows again that this type of employment was available, and that being bilingual wasn't actually necessary to work and to live in Randolph. So being monolingual was possible, but being bilingual Frisian was encouraged because it opened up work for other people too. This lady was only one of many more Frisian immigrants that came to the United States and particularly to Friesland, Wisconsin following the 1945 end of the Second World War and the liberation of the Netherlands. Many tens of thousands of Dutchmen left the Netherlands at this point, including many Frisians. And so we find another large wave coming into the settlement at this time, which is also commented upon by Busquet and Erasman as having a refreshing effect on the Frisian language community. They write, a cyclical situation then arises where the language island continually attracts new immigrants because of the use of the immigrant language in the community. These monolingual recent immigrants then in turn provide a more concentrated immigrant language community. Randolph Center continued to draw immigrants from Friesland, Netherlands in the decades following the 1910 US Census, resulting in comparatively much higher numbers of non-English proficient speakers. This is then interesting because it reinforces the Frisian character, and as I said, it meant that certain domains would remain Frisian. However, from the start, not every domain of life was actually linguistically Frisian. The home, as we've said, was Frisian for Frisian speakers that just came over to the United States. However, one that we've already talked about was the school. And the school, as per the law in the United States, was in English. There was no education held in Frisian, even if on the playground the children did speak Frisian. Another domain that wasn't in Frisian but that was ever present in the lives of these Frisian immigrants was that of the church. The church, which was also the services mostly held in English and much of the literature either in English or in Dutch, but never in Frisian. But how did this not have an effect and apply direct pressure to the status of the Frisian language in the home? Surely if these children are being educated in English every Sunday, are going to English church and are reading Bibles in Dutch, not in Frisian, this would have an effect on the Frisian language with so much exposure. Well, part of the reason why this didn't have a huge influence, or for example why it didn't mean people switched speaking English much faster, is because in the Netherlands, where they had been before in the province of Friesland, this exact situation existed too. Particularly for those immigrants coming following the Second World War, when the education system had been more formalized in the Netherlands, all of the education was done in Dutch, not in Frisian, and in fact it was often could be corporally punished if one spoke Frisian in school. Similarly, that was also the attitude at the time because of the discrimination on Frisian speakers by the Dutch government and the view at the time that Frisian was a lesser language than Dutch, that the only language used in churches was the Dutch language and not the Frisian language. And so Frisian speakers in Wisconsin were already used to this different segmentation of domains where certain domains were Frisian while other domains were Dutch. The only difference when they came to America was that instead of the school and the church being solely Dutch domains, they became English domains. And so the only thing that changed was the language. The segmentation remained the same. This is also commented upon. Busquet and Erasman say, the situation in Randolph Center and later Friesland, Wisconsin falls somewhere outside of both these situations. Church services were typically in English but occasionally in Dutch, as our interview subjects attest to. It was reported by multiple speakers that up until roughly 1999, a Dutch preacher had been coming to Friesland, Wisconsin from the Netherlands to deliver a church service entirely in Dutch. This had been done approximately every 2 years. Interviewed speakers reported that attendance for the Dutch language services was also very high, and though many Frisian proficient Wisconsin Frisians, that's quite a mouthful, could understand a good deal of the Dutch spoken, complete intelligibility was not the case. The language of worship, be it in English or Dutch, was restricted to the church domain and did not supplant Frisian language use. They continue saying that, according to interviewed speakers, the family Bible was read in Dutch, but prayers were said in Frisian. Interview subjects attested to prayers before and after meals being said in Frisian, and one speaker produced the Lord's Prayer in Frisian from memory. Both in the church and in the religious domestic domain, English and Dutch failed to affect the spoken language in the community, in this instance the spoken language being prayer. Dutch language use was restricted to the domain of reading the Bible and hearing the church service, but being thus restricted did not make any other impositions on Frisian language use. So that was how Frisian was able to be maintained throughout approximately 130 years since the 1880s, maybe a little bit earlier, despite the fact that many other immigrant communities much sooner lost their native language and switched to English. But what actually happened with the Frisian language in Wisconsin? Do they still speak Frisian there? What's going on? Well, to find that out, that will be the topic for another video, as this video is already rather long, but please do let me know in the comments below if you found this video interesting and would like to know anything else about this, perhaps a more linguistic take or more of a historical take on other Frisians that went to America or the Frisian languages back in Europe, then please do let me know. But I am planning to make a follow-up video on this of what happened to the Frisian speaking community in Wisconsin. Are they still happily speaking Frisian today, or have they indeed gone over to speaking English? As I said, there will be links in the description below to the articles that have been produced on this subject and that I have frequently referenced in this video. So a big thank you to those scholars for making that publicly available and for doing that painstaking research to document this very interesting case. Until then, I have been Hilbert and this has been The Skeerdness. Dank u wel en tot ziens.